In the summer of 1540, England's second most powerful man after the king would see his world unravel within mere days. Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son, who rose to the rank of Earl of Essex and served as Henry VIII's chief minister, was about to learn that being near absolute power could be more perilous than remaining distant from it. His tale remains one of history's most chilling examples of how, in the Tudor court, a trusted advisor today could become tomorrow's condemned traitor. The man who had engineered Cardinal Wolsey's demise, masterminded England's split from Rome, and sent many to their deaths, would soon be swallowed by the same judicial machine he had helped craft. What makes Cromwell's collapse particularly haunting is not only its rapidity, but the calculated ruthlessness with which it was enacted by the very monarch he had loyally served. Cromwell's rise to influence came from the unlikeliest beginnings. Born circa 1485 in Putney to a blacksmith and brewer, young Thomas fled England following a violent dispute with his father and sought opportunity on the battlefields and in the trade centers of continental Europe. His time in Italy introduced him to the harsh political doctrines of Machiavelli and advanced financial systems lessons that would later shape his political strategies at Henry's court. Upon returning to England, now wealthy and well-connected, Cromwell entered Cardinal Wolsey's service in the 1520s. With a brilliant legal intellect and mastery of both ecclesiastical and civil law, he proved instrumental in the complex deliberations surrounding Henry's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon when Wolsey fell from royal favor. In 1529, Cromwell carefully distanced himself from his disgraced patron and maneuvered into the king's inner circle. By 1532, Cromwell had become the king's chief secretary, and his power expanded dramatically. As the principal architect of the English Reformation, Cromwell acted not from personal faith, but from strategic political reasoning. Severing ties with the papacy solved Henry's marital issues and simultaneously enriched the crown with the wealth seized from monasteries. Cromwell's cold, systematic dismantling of long-held religious structures showcased both his bureaucratic brilliance and his emotional detachment. His tactics were precise and unsparing. Cromwell maintained a widespread surveillance network across England, something later hailed by author Hilary Mantel as the first modern intelligence system. He grasped that knowledge equaled control and wielded both with lethal precision. Opponents of Henry's religious reforms often found themselves accused of treason, with charges backed by evidence carefully orchestrated by Cromwell's operatives. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541 under Cromwell's direction, epitomized his style of rule. Historic religious institutions that had endured for generations were methodically stripped of assets, their lands handed to loyalists, and their members expelled with little recompense. The entire campaign was executed with militaristic discipline, channeling immense wealth to the monarchy, while eradicating a core element of medieval English life. Becoming Earl of Essex in 1540 appeared to mark the height of Cromwell's achievements. He had outlasted the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, skillfully maneuvered through the volatile politics of Henry VIII's many marriages, and amassed personal riches comparable to that of England's oldest aristocratic families. But this very triumph drew the attention of dangerous adversaries who waited for any indication of vulnerability. The irony of Cromwell's position lay in the fact that his power relied entirely on royal favorite. That very reliance made him a lightning rod for resentment, particularly from the traditional nobility, displaced by his ascent from humble beginnings and his revolutionary policies. These long-established elites, who had been sidelined by a common-born administrator, quietly bided their time. They knew well that the king's favor could shift as quickly as the wind, and they positioned themselves to benefit when Cromwell inevitably fell. His reputation for unflinching severity, which had once propelled him forward, also ensured he would receive no compassion should fortune turn. The same judicial tools he had wielded to eliminate his rivals would soon be deployed against him by those who had mastered his strategies. In the ruthless arena of Tudor politics, Cromwell had made himself essential to governance, but in doing so, he had also isolated himself. The seeds of Cromwell's ruin were sown by a single diplomatic blunder with grave consequences. In his drive to secure Henry's fourth marriage and solidify ties with the Protestant German states, Cromwell arranged the king's engagement to Anne of Cleves without gaining the monarch's direct approval of her appearance. Though the match, formalized in late 1539, made political sense, it proved a personal catastrophe for Henry. Upon meeting Anne in January 1540, the king's disappointment was swift and disastrous for Cromwell's career. Expecting a beauty based on Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, Henry instead met a woman he found unattractive and uninspiring. His infamous remark that Anne resembled a Flanders mare captured not only his personal revulsion, but also his deepening bitterness toward the minister who had orchestrated the union. The political stakes of the failed marriage far exceeded mere personal dissatisfaction. The union symbolized an alliance with the Protestant German states, at a time when Henry was rethinking his approach to foreign diplomacy. The Catholic powers, especially Emperor Charles VIII, presenting compelling alternatives that would necessitate dissolving the Protestant connection Cromwell had so carefully built. This placed Cromwell in a no-win situation, torn between upholding the Protestant alliance and appeasing a monarch, desperate to escape a marriage he despised. His attempts to secure an annulment were hampered by the very meticulousness he had applied to the original contract. The diplomatic scaffolding Cromwell had erected to support the match now stood as a barrier to its reversal. The king's growing marital frustration soon became entangled with larger religious issues, making Cromwell's political footing even more precarious. Conservative nobles, spearheaded by the Duke of Norfolk, began pressing for renewed ties with Catholic Europe and a rollback of some of Cromwell's most radical religious reforms. They claimed that Cromwell's aggressive Protestant agenda had left England diplomatically isolated and had needlessly antagonized the continent's established powers. Henry's growing affection for Catherine Howard, Norfolk's youthful niece, handed the Conservatives a potent tool in their campaign against Cromwell. The prospect of a fifth marriage promised the king both emotional satisfaction and political flexibility, but achieving it meant dismantling the obstacles imposed by Cromwell's previous strategies. The once crucial post of chief minister had, in the eyes of the king, become a stumbling block to his personal contentment. Cromwell's handling of the crisis revealed both his sharp political instincts and the limits of his power. He moved swiftly to secure Anne of Cleves's consent to an annulment while attempting to retain his grip on religious reform. Yet his adversaries, having studied his tactics closely, began methodically assembling a case against him using the very mechanisms he had perfected. The rapid collapse of Cromwell's standing reflected the fragility of power within Henry's volatile court. Only months after receiving his earldom, Cromwell found himself charged with heresy and treason by the same figures who once bowed to his authority. The administrative system he had helped design now served his foes, who used it to meticulously document the allegations that would seal his fate. The conspiracy against Cromwell was executed with the kind of ruthless precision that had once defined his ascent. The Duke of Norfolk, leading the traditionalist Catholic bloc, understood that royal anger alone would not suffice. Cromwell's destruction required a well-crafted legal case that could justify the severe punishment they intended. Norfolk's strategy hinged on exploiting the king's increasing fears around religious purity and loyalty. He knew that charges of heresy would resonate with a monarch who had long styled himself as the guardian of true faith against both papal interference and Protestant radicalism. Framing Cromwell as a hidden zealot who had twisted royal policy to suit his own doctrinal goals allowed Norfolk to inflame the king's discontent into righteous indignation. To support their claims, the conservative faction combed through Cromwell's communications with Protestant figures across Europe, focusing especially on his links with more extreme voices in the German Lutheran movement. Letters that had once been viewed as wise diplomatic overtures were now reinterpreted as signs of treasonous plotting. Cromwell's international Protestant ties, once seen as diplomatic strengths, were transformed into damning proof of dangerous sympathies. Stephen Gardiner, the conservative Bishop of Winchester, became instrumental in constructing the theological argument against Cromwell. A long-standing rival, Gardiner viewed Cromwell's downfall as a chance to restore ecclesiastical authority over England's religious direction. His scholarly reputation added weight to claims that Cromwell had embraced doctrinal heresies at odds with the king's personal beliefs. The timing of this campaign was no coincidence. It coincided deliberately with Henry's romantic obsession with Catherine Howard. Norfolk recognized that his niece's rising influence over the king offered a rare chance to move against Cromwell, while Henry was emotionally distracted and politically vulnerable. Catherine's youth and charm stood in sharp contrast to Anne of Cleves, deepening Henry's conviction that Cromwell had misled him regarding the German alliance. As word of the unfolding scheme spread in hushed whispers and subtle glances, court life changed noticeably. Those who once sought Cromwell's patronage began withdrawing, their political instincts warning them to sever ties before they too were caught in the coming storm. The very instincts that had elevated many of them now signaled that Cromwell's downfall was imminent. Cromwell, for his part, appeared unaware of the full scale of the conspiracy brewing against him. His belief in his own essential role left him blind to the meticulous efforts of his rivals, and his attention remained fixed on the immediate crisis of Henry's failed marriage. This misjudgment would ultimately cost him dearly in the unforgiving world of Tudor politics. By the spring of 1540, the final preparations for his downfall were nearly complete. Norfolk and his faction believed they had compiled enough evidence charges of religious deviance and secretive dealings with foreign powers to convince the king. They had also won the allegiance of critical court figures needed to execute their plan. All that remained was selecting the most effective moment to trigger their ambush. The 10th of June, 1540, began uneventfully for Thomas Cromwell. As Lord Privy Seal and newly titled Earl of Essex, he joined the regular council session at Westminster, engaging in routine discussions with fellow officials. Nothing in his behavior suggested he anticipated the political earthquake about to strike, though some would later claim to have sensed an unusual tension in the chamber. The betrayal came with brutal speed. Midway through the meeting, the Duke of Norfolk stood and read formal accusations against Cromwell, citing treason and heresy. The charges were sweeping: that he had spread heretical beliefs, conspired with foreign adversaries, and misled the king on crucial matters of state. Cromwell's response was stunned disbelief. The architect of so many similar scenes now found himself trapped in the same mechanisms of power he had once controlled. His attempts to respond were abruptly silenced as Norfolk called for his immediate arrest. The proceedings moved with such speed that Cromwell had no time to mount the sort of strategic legal defense he had often orchestrated against others. Every detail of the arrest was designed for maximum humiliation. In front of the entire council, Cromwell was stripped of the Garter Insigniath, highest honor in England, granted to him only recently. His official staff was shattered and discarded, and his ceremonial sword was taken away. Symbolic acts that finalized his dramatic descent from noble statesman to ordinary detainee. Eyewitness accounts describe a heavy silence falling over the room following Cromwell's arrest. Longtime colleagues sat motionless, paralyzed by fear that any gesture of sympathy might be construed as sharing in his alleged betrayals. The atmosphere grew thick with unease as everyone grasped the gravity of seeing the king's most powerful subject transformed into a shackled prisoner within moments. The act of chaining Cromwell was especially potent in Tudor symbolism. Shackles were more than just tools of detention. They were powerful emblems of disgrace, typically reserved for common lawbreakers, not members of the aristocracy. Norfolk's insistence on immediate shackling ensured that Cromwell's humiliation would be both total and public. The news spread through London at lightning speed, stirring shock and fascination among both courtiers and ordinary citizens. People who had observed Cromwell's ascent with equal parts awe and bitterness now poured into the streets to witness his undoing. The rapid shift from near sovereign authority to utter helplessness was a striking reminder of how fragile political standing could be in Henry's England. The psychological toll on Cromwell appeared immense. Observers noted how dramatically he seemed to age in mere hours. The once assured statesman now reduced to a dazed, frightened figure who struggled to grasp the extent of his downfall. His public persona, meticulously built over years, began to unravel the moment he was taken into custody, and the unraveling would continue throughout his confinement and prosecution. Cromwell's internment in the Tower of London signaled the beginning of a calculated campaign aimed at breaking him both mentally and physically. The fortress that had served as the last stop for many of his political victims now became his own cell, haunted by the specters of those he had condemned. The contrast between his former splendor and current hardship was deliberately stark. The fine robes, gourmet meals, and lavish chambers of his political peak were replaced by a dim, cold stone cell and coarse prison attire. These degrading conditions were designed to remind him and all who heard of it that his rise had come to a ruinous end. Interrogators employed psychological tactics that Cromwell himself had once refined. While physical torment remained an option, the focus was on sustained mental manipulation. That he now found himself the subject of methods he had previously devised added a cruel twist to his suffering. Aware of the expertise of his interrogators, Cromwell faced intense questioning centered on two major accusations: his supposed heretical views and his alleged secret dealings with foreign entities. The authorities held a trove of his letters collected using the very surveillance networks he had built. which they now twisted to portray harmless diplomatic exchanges as evidence of subversive intent. The psychological torment was compounded by calculated visits from former allies who had now turned their backs on him. These meetings served several strategic purposes. They deepened his sense of isolation, provided insights into his mental state, and gave his enemies fresh opportunities to pressure him into incriminating himself. The succession of once close friends treating him like a stranger only deepened his despondency. Physical discomfort further eroded his resilience. The meager rations, coupled with the overwhelming stress, rapidly affected his health. Eyewitnesses described his transformation. The once robust figure now gaunt and pallid, his eyes hollowed by relentless psychological strain. Interrogations were carried out with a cold precision that mirrored the very tactics Cromwell had once employed against religious reformers and rivals. His examiners alternated between aggressive questioning and feigned sympathia, psychological tactic meant to disorient him and increase the likelihood of him confessing to their accusations. Perhaps the most demoralizing element of his imprisonment was the complete silence from Henry VIII monarch. He had loyally served for years. No emissary arrived with words of support or mercy. This lack of royal communication delivered a devastating blow, making clear that Cromwell had been utterly forsaken and that any hope for reprieve was futile. Instead of subjecting Cromwell to a courtroom trial, his opponents opted for a Bill of Attainder legislative decree that declared him guilty of treason without due legal process. This route offered several strategic benefits. It removed the need for public evidence, circumvented any chance for him to mount a defense, and allowed politics, not justice, to determine the outcome. This use of the Bill of Attainder marked an especially manipulative application of parliamentary power, turning a body meant for governance into a tool for personal vengeance. The accusations it contained were sweeping but ambiguous, charging Cromwell with treasons, murders, robberies, and other most heinous offenses, without providing clear evidence that might be contested or disproven. The religious accusations formed the backbone of the case brought against Cromwell. The bill charged him with promoting unorthodox religious ideas, shielding known heretics, and challenging the king's supremacy in spiritual matters. These charges were particularly harmful because they struck at the heart of Henry's obsession with doctrinal purity and his ambition to be recognized as the true protector of Christian belief, standing firm against both Rome and radical reformers. In contrast, the treason allegations were more pointed. They focused on Cromwell's purported secret communications with foreign adversaries and alleged efforts to steer royal decisions for his personal gain. The most damaging claim was that he had deceitfully arranged the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves, fully aware that it would harm both Henry's reputation and the country's political interests. This transformed a diplomatic blunder into an accusation of deliberate betrayal. The parliamentary process was meticulously choreographed to ensure Cromwell's downfall. His allies in Parliament, cowed by his swift fall from power, chose silence rather than jeopardize their own safety. The few who dared speak on his behalf were quickly shut down, reminded of the gravity of the charges and the king's displeasure. The bill sped through both houses with little resistance, as MPs knew any dissent would be viewed as treachery. What should have been a deliberative legal process became a mere facade. Parliament, instead of evaluating evidence or engaging in meaningful debate, merely rubber-stamped a verdict that had already been decided. The bill not only sentenced Cromwell to death, but also stripped him of all his wealth and privileges, extending the punishment to his entire lineage and ensuring that his family would be permanently erased from the noble order. Learning of the attainder bill's passage was a crushing psychological blow to Cromwell. The irony was profound. The very legislative tools he had once wielded to solidify Henry's authority were now being used to obliterate him. The machinery he had engineered was turned on him with merciless speed and efficiency. The time between his sentencing and his execution was dominated by efforts to wring every last benefit from his hopeless situation. His foes knew that a condemned man, clinging to the faintest hope of mercy, might yet be persuaded to render final services. The most significant of these was his role in unraveling the marriage to Anne of Cleves. Even as he awaited his own death, Cromwell was compelled to apply his legal acumen and diplomatic influence to dissolve the very union he had helped create. This final demand added a cruel twist to his final days, assisting in the dismantling of his own legacy while staring down the inevitability of his own demise. The annulment proceedings moved forward through a mixture of fading hope and pressing desperation. Though Cromwell knew that his execution was nearly inevitable, the slim chance that exemplary service might earn him a royal pardon drove him to comply with every demand. His intimate knowledge of the marriage negotiations uniquely positioned him to uncover legal grounds for the union's dissolution, and his previous diplomatic ties could still be useful in gaining Anne of Cleves's consent. The mental strain of his final weeks was clearly visible in accounts from the time. Visitors to his prison noted that he looked significantly aged, his hair having turned white, and his face deeply furrowed with anxiety and hopelessness. The once fearsome political strategist had become a shattered figure, reduced to pleading for his life. Religious reflection came to dominate Cromwell's thoughts as the end drew near. Accused of heresy, he began to seek solace in the council of Protestant ministers, trying to reconcile his failures in life with a longing for divine forgiveness. These visits offered limited emotional relief while conveniently supporting his enemies' portrayal of him as a theological deviant. All his communication with loved ones was tightly monitored. Every letter was inspected by guards before being sent or received. The few surviving correspondences show a man wrestling to retain his dignity, even as he acknowledged his grim fate. His messages to his son Gregory are especially moving. Cromwell tried to offer guidance to a young man who would bear the weight of his father's disgrace. The logistics of his execution sparked considerable debate among the court's officials. The manner of death, whether the horrific fate of hanging, drawing, and quartering for traitors, or the more honorable beheading reserved for nobles, would serve as a final statement of the king's judgment. This choice would not only reflect on Cromwell's status, but also shape perceptions of Henry's justice and mercy. Despite everything, Cromwell clung to a desperate hope for mercy. His captors exploited this, feeding him just enough encouragement to keep him compliant and cooperative. They knew that a condemned man clinging to hope was easier to control than one resigned to death. This cruel manipulation ensured that his final days were filled with psychological agony as well as physical suffering. On the morning of the 28th of July, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led from his cell to the scaffold. The date was no accident. It was chosen to coincide with Henry's wedding to Catherine Howard. The king's celebration would not be overshadowed by thoughts of his fallen minister. The timing was yet another act of calculated cruelty in Cromwell's carefully orchestrated demise. His walk to execution was choreographed to strip him of every last vestige of dignity. Once a figure of grandeur, traveling in stately procession, Cromwell now trudged in chains past the jeering crowds gathered to witness his demise. The stark contrast between his former splendor and current disgrace served as a grim reminder of the fleeting nature of political power, a message that was not lost on those watching. The scaffold was erected on Tower Hill, the customary site for executing traitors and elite criminals. Positioned high above the crowd, it ensured Cromwell's death would be clearly visible, transforming his final moments into a public display meant to reinforce royal supremacy and appease the bloodthirsty curiosity of the masses. Tudor executions were designed as spectacles where justice was dramatized for political effect. Eyewitnesses noted Cromwell's demeanor as a blend of resignation and resolve. While he retained the poise expected of a man of rank facing execution, his voice reportedly trembled as he spoke his final words. He carefully avoided any hint of protest that might suggest the king's justice was flawed, yet still tried to preserve a shred of personal honor. The execution was carried out with the trademark precision of Tudor punishment. Cromwell was granted the privilege of beheading, a more dignified death than the brutal alternative of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Whether this showed residual royal favor or mere practicality, the executioner's axe delivered a swift end with a single, practiced stroke. What followed underscored the cold orchestration of his fall. Cromwell's severed head was mounted on London Bridge beside other traitors, a macabre warning to dissenters. His remains were interred in an unmarked grave, denying him the burial honors due his rank and ensuring no future shrine could form around his memory. Word of his death quickly swept through England and across Europe, stirring reactions of relief, fear, and contemplation. Foreign envoys informed their courts of the grim spectacle, interpreting it as evidence of England's volatile politics and the peril of serving a monarch with unchecked authority. The ruthless efficiency of Cromwell's elimination stood as a chilling assertion of royal might and a signal to would-be opponents. Once deemed essential to the state, he was now nothing more than a head on a Pikese lineage. Disgraced, his possessions seized, and his reputation reduced to that of a traitor. The thoroughness of his destruction illustrated how thoroughly Tudor justice could erase a person from power and memory. The historical record of Cromwell's final chapter is clouded by partisan accounts, shaped by political leanings and personal grievances. These conflicting reports have fueled ongoing scholarly debates over the legitimacy of the charges, the fairness of his punishment, and the truth behind his downfall. Catholic commentators of the time, writing from the perspective of Cromwell's religious adversaries, often depicted his fall as a form of divine punishment for his role in dismantling England's long-established religious structures. These accounts highlighted his modest background and perceived doctrinal errors, framing his downfall as the natural result of his audacity in challenging ecclesiastical tradition. Many narratives also alleged he behaved with cowardice and desperation during his imprisonment. In contrast, Protestant chroniclers portrayed Cromwell as a martyr for reformist ideals, undone by reactionary forces, bent on reversing his progressive changes. These writers emphasized his administrative talents and his efforts in liberating England from papal influence. According to their version, his demise was not due to genuine wrongdoing, but rather the product of political scheming and courtly betrayal. They often cast doubt on the validity of the accusations and presented his execution as a grave miscarriage of justice. A third viewpoint emerges from foreign diplomatic correspondence, which concentrated on the international repercussions of Cromwell's fall. These sources generally overlooked domestic theological disputes and instead focused on the disruption his removal caused to England's Protestant alliances abroad networks he had painstakingly developed. Observers on the continent found the manner of his ousting revealing of deeper currents within English governance, particularly its readiness to employ brutal, opaque tactics. Modern scholarship continues to wrestle with these conflicting depictions, complicated by the scarcity of surviving documentation. Cromwell's adversaries had thoroughly purged records related to his policies and actions, making it difficult to determine the legitimacy of the charges. While some historians maintain that he exceeded his authority and pursued self-serving agendas, others argue he fell victim to a calculated political execution masked as justice. The debate over Cromwell's supposed heretical inclinations remains especially divisive, though evidence confirms his communication with Protestant thinkers and his endorsement of reform-minded measures. The depth of his personal faith convictions remains ambiguous. Some suggest his policies were tactical rather than theological, aimed at reinforcing the crown's power rather than promoting a specific creed. Recent studies place Cromwell's fate within the broader landscape of Tudor-era governance and the unique dynamics of Henry VIII's inner circle. These perspectives emphasize systemic causes policy disputes, personality clashes, and the inherent volatility of power rooted in royal whim. Such interpretations shift attention from individual culpability to the broader fragility of political survival in this period. The ongoing historical discourse over Cromwell's end reflects deeper issues concerning Tudor legal practices and the blurred line between law and political vendetta. His story exemplifies the difficulties in separating justice from persecution in a regime where procedural fairness was often subordinate to political utility. In the months following Thomas Cromwell's execution, Henry VIII began showing clear signs of remorse for the loss of his trusted minister. His regret stemmed not from ethical concerns, but from a growing awareness that he had removed the most effective administrator in his realm at a moment when strong leadership was crucial. The administrative disarray that ensued highlighted just how irreplaceable Cromwell's organizational skills had been. Cromwell's absence quickly caused major disruptions in religious policy, diplomacy, and financial governance. Henry realized that the systematic structures his minister had put in place created a level of efficiency unmatched by those who followed. The nobleman who had plotted Cromwell's fall proved far more adept at dismantling his influence than filling the void he left behind. Henry's well-known complaint that he had been misled by false allegations in the matter of Cromwell's execution revealed a growing recognition of his misjudgment, though characteristically, he placed the blame on others rather than accept accountability. This deflection of responsibility had always been part of the king's nature and would continue to mark his reign. The broader consequences of Cromwell's downfall extended well beyond bureaucratic disruption. His execution signaled the collapse of the strategic, reform-minded structure that had guided the early English Reformation. Without Cromwell's leadership, religious decisions became increasingly erratic, shaped more by Henry's shifting theological views than by a unified plan. Internationally, the effects were equally dramatic. The Protestant alliances Cromwell had painstakingly built unraveled almost immediately after his death, leaving England isolated on the global stage and exposed to Catholic hostility. German rulers who had trusted Cromwell as England's chief Protestant intermediary now questioned the reliability of English policy and began realigning their strategies. In modern historical analysis, Cromwell's legacy has undergone extensive reevaluation as scholars gained access to new archival materials. Earlier portrayals either as a visionary reformer or dangerous zealothave, given way to a more balanced interpretation. Today, Cromwell is often seen as a pragmatic and capable administrator who prioritized practical governance over rigid ideology. Historians particularly note the techniques Cromwell used to rise and maintain his influence, viewing him as a pioneer of statecraft. His strategic deployment of surveillance, propaganda, and legal reform foreshadowed key aspects of modern government. His capacity to execute and synchronize complex reforms across various sectors demonstrated a grasp of administrative systems far ahead of his time. The savage manner of Cromwell's downfall serves as a stark illustration of the personal toll political involvement could exact in early modern Europe. The same unyielding precision that had marked his governmental strategies was turned inward during his demise, producing a seamless loop of action and consequence that has both captivated and disturbed generations of historians. His story maintains relevance because it encapsulates universal truths about authority, ambition, and the dangers inherent in wielding power. The harrowing conclusion to Thomas Cromwell's life provides a vivid look into the merciless dynamics of Tudor-era politics, where closeness to sovereign power could, without warning, become a path to destruction. It remains a powerful reminder of how swiftly fortune could shift in royal courts and how the very tools that elevate a man might also ensure his ruin. Cromwell's fate is unsettling not only for its speed, but for its chilling deliberateness. The very bureaucracy and mechanisms he had developed were employed with brutal precision against him. His adversaries had studied his tactics, well, having once observed him dismantle others, and they replicated his strategies with relentless accuracy. The student had surpassed the teacher. The creator had become the casualty. The psychological weight of his collapse underscores the emotional cost of high political stakes within an autocracy. A man once adept at maneuvering through the corridors of power became powerless in the grip of the very system he had shaped. His final days marked by futile efforts to earn reprieve through last acts of loyalty reveal the deep fragility of those who depend wholly on royal favor. His solitude and despair serve as a haunting testament to the personal risks of political life. The ongoing disputes among scholars regarding Cromwell's nature and actions attest to the enduring complexity of his legacy. Some still portray him as a forward-thinking reformer undone by reactionary forces, while others view him as a tyrannical bureaucrat who ultimately overreached. This uncertainty surrounding his true intentions continues to fuel historical interest. More profoundly, Cromwell's fate lays bare the inherent instability of governance built on individual will rather than structural checks. The ease with which his condemnation and execution were orchestrated reveals how swiftly legal norms can be overwritten for political ends when unchecked authority is concentrated in one ruler's hands. His fall serves as a potent warning of the dangers posed by unchecked power and the precarity faced by those who serve it. Yet Cromwell's innovations in statecraft, particularly in creating efficient administrative system endured far beyond his political failures. While his name was long synonymous with betrayal, modern recognition of his governance skills highlights a legacy rooted in institutional evolution, not just personal tragedy. Though his name became a byword for betrayal in the immediate wake of his execution, contemporary historians acknowledge his vital role in shaping efficient state governance. The bitter irony that the very systems he pioneered ultimately facilitated his downfall adds further depth to his historical relevance. Henry VIII's later regret over ordering Cromwell's death stands as a final acknowledgement of the administrator's true worth and a damning indictment of the short-sightedness behind his removal. The king's own admission that he had been misled by those who urged Cromwell's destruction came far too late to alter the minister's fate, yet it confirms the wisdom and ability Cromwell had long displayed. The administrative disorder that erupted in his absence underscored the immense challenge of replacing a figure of such rare competence. Regardless of political enmities, the continuing intrigue surrounding Cromwell's life and death endures because it captures timeless truths about power, drive, and the complexities of human ambition. His journey from modest beginnings to the summit of royal authority illustrates what can be achieved through talent and strategic skill, while his sudden collapse underscores how fragile such success can be in the volatile world of court politics. Ultimately, the grim final chapter of Cromwell's life serves both as a compelling historical episode and a universal reflection on the high cost of political power and the perilous seduction of absolute rule.